The FAA discretionary enforcement for remote ID is over. Now, this means that all remote ID drones that are required to be registered or are registered now need to have remote ID. Let's get to some details. I wanted to do a quick recap of remote ID because I know there's a lot of confusion out there. So we're going to talk about what it is, who needs to comply, maybe how remote ID kind of works, and then how you can actually comply with your drone. And then lastly, to find out if your drone is compliant. So first thing is, what is remote ID? You may be wondering. Well, remote ID is what the FAA defines as the license plate for your drone. It's a digital license plate for your drone. It's a technology that will allow the FAA and law enforcement and also the general public to identify aircraft as they fly, aircraft being your drone. Now, the regulation is filed under 14 CFR Part 89. If you can't fall asleep at night, that's a great document to read. Now, who must comply with remote ID regulation? Well, any unmanned aircraft that require to be registered or is registered must comply with remote ID. That means all aircraft that are under 55 pounds that are operated under Part 107. It also means all aircraft over 250 grams that are flown for recreational purposes. That's right. If your drone is under 250 grams and it is flown recreationally, it does not need to have a registration, which means it also doesn't need to have remote ID. Now, as soon as the drone is over that weight on takeoff, let's say that you put a light on top of it or maybe prop guards, then now it needs to have registration. It needs to have also remote ID. Now, unmanned aircraft that are operated for public safety also must comply. This is sometimes a point that people forget. Now, federal government agencies are exempt from remote ID, but not your state, local, or tribal agencies. Also, there is an exemption for drones that are operated for aeronautical research, which is actually a very, very specific thing. Now you're going to say, what kind of information is being sent from my drone? Well, there is two different types of messages, but they're very close to each other. It actually depends on the way that your drone complies with remote ID. Now, there are drones that have remote ID integrated into them directly. That's called a standard remote ID drone. Now, in this case, what's going to be sent is the serial number of the drone, the latitude, longitude, altitude, and velocity of the aircraft, and also the latitude, longitude, and altitude of the control station. There's also an emergency status that is technically being sent and a time mark. Now, this is for drones that are already equipped with remote ID when you buy them. If you don't have one of those, then you're going to have to use a remote ID module. That remote ID module has a slightly different message that it sends. It sends the serial number of the module in itself. It also sends latitude, longitude, altitude, and velocity of the aircraft, but it does not send the location of the pilot. It sends the location of takeoff. So it records only at that time of takeoff, and it's going to keep sending that information to other devices around you. It doesn't have emergency status information, and it also has a time mark. Now, how does that work? Well, imagine your drone being kind of like a Wi-Fi router. That's how I like to describe it. The drone takes off and now it starts to send a Wi-Fi signal. Now, it's not always Wi-Fi. It could also be Bluetooth in some cases, but most drones that have it integrated into the drone in itself, standard remote ID uses Wi-Fi technology. Modules typically use Bluetooth technology, but that's besides the point. The drone is flying around and it's broadcasting that signal so that someone on the ground can receive the information on typically a cell phone. So law enforcement, FAA, and the general public have the ability to download an app and be able to see that signal and be able to see the aircraft information that I just mentioned from that message. Now, a little bit more information about the remote ID module, which is the second method to comply with remote ID. This is what you're going to use if you have an older aircraft that is not going to have remote ID integrated into it, standard remote ID. In this case, you're going to buy this module and then you're going to put that module on top of the drone, turn it on before you fly. Now, there's a module serial number that's going to be provided to you. This is what you're going to attach to the registration record for your unmanned aircraft. Now, I know this can be a little bit confusing, so we actually have a full video right here that's going to help you figure out where the serial number is located for your specific type of aircraft and how to put that in your registration record. Now, there's another method that we don't usually talk a whole lot about, but if you have a drone that is not compliant with remote ID and you don't want to buy a module, well, you can fly at one of these places that's called a FRIA. And the FRIA is the FAA Recognized Identification Area, FRIA for short, and that's for any aircraft that don't have remote ID. You can fly there. It's kind of a free It's a remote ID free zone if you want. Typically, these are located with community-based organizations. So if you're a member of one of the 4 community-based organizations, you'll be able to find areas around the country where you can fly your drone without remote ID. Now, to be fair, these areas are usually pretty limited in scope. So if you want the freedom of flying anywhere, you're going to need to have the remote ID module or standard remote ID drone. There's a website we'll put down in the description where you can find different FRIAs near you. Now, you may be wondering, Greg, how do I figure out if my drone is actually compliant already? Well, good news, there is an FAA website for that. Again, we'll put a link down in the description right here. You're going to search the drone type and the drone manufacturer, and you'll be able to see it. Make sure that you filter by RID, not by OOP. OOP is for operation over people. Now, you might be wondering and getting all the way here, and why a new video on this topic? Well, because the FAA back at the end of last year, they said, well, we're going to wait a little bit to enforce remote ID because we know there's a delay for modules especially, and we know people have been having a hard time to comply. So the FAA pushed the enforcement until March 16. Now keep in mind, they never pushed the regulation. The actual regulation has always been in place. The FAA wanted to make sure that you had time to comply. This is the end of it right here. March 16, if you do not have a remote ID module or if your drone is not equipped with remote ID internally, then you are exposing yourself to having a fine from the FAA if they catch you. Now, this means that remote ID, again, is required for all drones that are either registered or need to be registered with the FAA. Now, we made a video back in August where we tested a whole lot of different remote ID modules, but more of them have come out ever since. So here's a list right here of a bunch of different modules that you can purchase at the moment. It depends on the capabilities that you want, and then also I'm sure it depends on the price. So take a look at this, and then we'll see you in the next video.